Hey guys, tonight we're not just going to talk about history. We're going to feel it. Imagine, if you will, the deep, impenetrable blackness of a 19th century night at sea. You're not on a cruise ship with GPS and satellite navigation. Oh no. You're huddled on a wooden vessel, creaking and groaning, at the mercy of an ocean that feels infinite and utterly indifferent. The air is thick with salt. The cold seeps into your bones, and every single wave could be the one that sends you to the bottom. You probably won't survive this, not without a guiding light. And for most of human history, there wasn't one. The thought alone is enough to make you pull your blankets up a little tighter, isn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling adventurous, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're out there, adrift in that inky void. And all you have is the stars, if they're visible, and a prayer. For centuries, maritime travel was less about getting from A to B and more about a desperate gamble against the elements. Shipwrecks weren't anomalies. They were a grim, almost expected, part of the nautical landscape. Think about it. No radar, no sonar, no reliable charts for every treacherous rock just beneath the surface. You'd hug the coastline during the day, hoping for a familiar landmark. And then, as twilight bled into night, you'd either drop anchor in a hopefully sheltered cove or just keep going, holding your breath. This wasn't just a problem for grand voyages across oceans. Even coastal trading routes were fraught with peril. A sudden squall, a shift in the wind, or just a simple miscalculation could send an entire cargo, and every soul aboard, crashing against a hidden reef. Historians still argue whether the sheer number of unrecorded shipwrecks vastly outnumbers the documented ones, suggesting an even more brutal reality than we currently imagine. One that is truly difficult for our modern, interconnected minds to fully grasp. The scale of loss, both human and material, was immense and largely unquantified. The very idea of a safe passage was a luxury most sailors couldn't afford. They lived in a constant state of low-grade dread, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. One mainstream historical fact often overlooked is that before dedicated lighthouses, coastal communities would sometimes light bonfires on prominent headlands. These fires weren't always for benevolent navigation. Sometimes they were lit to warn off approaching vessels, or even, more darkly, as lures. Imagine the chilling thought of lights deliberately placed to entice a ship towards a rocky shore, not to save it, but to wreck it for its valuable cargo. It was a brutal aspect of coastal life in some areas, a stark contrast to the selfless duty of later lighthouse keepers. This wasn't exactly a standardized system, as you can imagine. There was no official government agency overseeing these lights, no uniform regulations. You were essentially relying on the good nature, or perhaps the ill nature, of strangers on shore. Imagine relying on your eccentric Uncle Barry's bonfire, visible only if he remembered to light it, and if the wind was blowing the right way, and if he wasn't feeling particularly mischievous that evening. A quirky tidbit some ancient mariners, in desperate times, would even release birds at sea, hoping they would fly towards land and thus indicate its direction. It was a rather feathery, feckle form of GPS, I suppose. If your bird wasn't having an off day or just decided to fly around in circles, perhaps complaining about the lack of in-flight snacks. The sea was a voracious beast, swallowing ships and their stories whole, leaving little trace. It truly was a slow, agonizing process of trial and error for anyone venturing out of sight of land. A testament to humanity's stubborn desire to connect, trade, and explore. Despite the terrifying odds, the sheer volume of traffic, even in those earlier centuries, meant that even a low percentage of wrecks translated into significant loss. Every trading route, every fishing ground, had its own grim reputation, whispered about in taverns along the coast. The absence of reliable navigation wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an active threat. A silent predator lurking just beneath the waves. And into this world of perpetual maritime anxiety, a glimmer of hope, quite literally, began to emerge, slowly, painstakingly, through the collective efforts of civilizations striving for a safer passage. You could say it was the very darkness that finally spurred the light. As the demand for safer sea travel grew, so too did the ingenuity of ancient civilizations. You might imagine a sudden flash of inspiration, a eureka moment. But the evolution of guiding lights was a slow, incremental process, built on necessity and trial and error, much like trying to figure out how to best arrange your socks drawer for optimal efficiency. Think back to those earliest bonfires, a simple concept, really, but one that paved the way for something far more sophisticated. The first true attempts at dedicated navigation aids weren't much more than large fires kept burning on elevated points. Imagine the sheer, unremitting effort involved hauling tons of wood up steep cliffs, constantly battling the wind and rain to keep the flames alive, assigning someone to the never-ending, soot-stained task of tending the blaze, often through cold, lonely nights. It was rudimentary. Sure, but it was a start, a desperate signal in the darkness. These fires, often built by local communities or religious groups, served as vital beacons for returning fishermen and wary merchants, a flickering promise of safety just beyond the treacherous waves. Now, fast forward a bit, and you begin to see more deliberate and structured attempts at permanent aids. The ancient Egyptians, Phoenicians, and Greeks, all formidable maritime powers, understood the vital importance of guiding ships through their busy ports and along their trade routes. One mainstream historical fact you might recall is the Pharaohs of Alexandria, one of the legendary 7 wonders of the ancient world. Built around 280 BC, this colossal lighthouse stood hundreds of feet tall, an architectural marvel of its age. Its light, possibly a massive fire magnified by sophisticated polished metal mirrors, was said to be visible for dozens of miles, cutting through the Mediterranean night like a shining sword. Imagine the awe of sailors spotting that beam after weeks at sea. A true beacon of civilization and safety. But even something as grand and technologically advanced for its time as the Pharaohs wasn't without its challenges. Maintaining such a structure, constantly feeding its massive fire, ensuring the integrity of its optical system, and its sheer stability through centuries of earthquakes and storms was an immense undertaking, a testament to the organizational power of an empire. Historians still argue whether its light source was purely open flame, or if highly advanced polished metal mirrors were indeed used to significantly intensify and direct the beam, showcasing an unexpectedly sophisticated understanding of optics for its time. Of course, not every ancient guiding light was a wonder of the world, destined to be etched into the annals of history. Many were far more modest, perhaps just a simple brazier atop a natural cliff face, a signal fire on a purpose-built stone platform, or a small, relatively unassuming stone tower. These smaller, more numerous lights served crucial local purposes, guiding ships into specific harbors or around particularly dangerous shoals. A quirky tidbit from this era is that some coastal communities in ancient times would even use whitewashed cliffs or prominent natural features as daytime navigation aids, essentially painting giant, natural arrows or landmarks on the landscape. It was like nature's own primitive signage, before the advent of actual road signs. If those road signs were just incredibly large, strategically bleached rocks, imagine a captain squinting through the morning mist, trying to discern if that particular white patch on the cliff was the one he was looking for, or just a really unfortunate, very large bird convention that had left its mark. The biggest challenge for these early lighthouses wasn't just the sheer labor involved in keeping the light going, or the primitive nature of their light sources, but also the inherent vulnerability of the structures themselves. Built with the technology of their time, often without deep foundations or modern cementing techniques, they were highly susceptible to the relentless forces of nature, earthquakes, tsunamis, fierce storms, and the slow, relentless erosion of the sea. The Pharaohs, for all its glory and historical significance, eventually succumbed to a series of powerful earthquakes over centuries, gradually crumbling and fading from the maritime map. So, while these ancient beacons provided invaluable service, guiding countless vessels and saving untold lives, they were also a stark reminder of humanity's ongoing, often losing, struggle against the formidable power of nature. They were temporary triumphs, shining brightly for a time, only to be swallowed by history, much like the ships they were meant to protect. Yet, their existence proved one undeniable truth. The need for reliable guidance at sea was not just a luxury, but a desperate, life-saving necessity. A need that would drive even greater innovation in the centuries to come, pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible. The transition from ancient, often temporary, beacons to truly modern lighthouses wasn't a sudden leap, but a slow, deliberate climb, punctuated by significant breakthroughs in engineering and a growing understanding of the brutal, unyielding forces of nature. You can almost feel the tangible shift in the air, from a world where crude bonfires were the best you could hope for, to one where human ingenuity began to truly challenge the sea's destructive power, one carefully placed stone at a time. The 18th and 19th centuries, in particular, marked a period of immense progress, often directly spurred by tragic shipwrecks that underscored, in the most devastating way possible, the desperate need for more robust, reliable, and permanent navigational aids. Imagine the collective sigh of relief, perhaps even a gasp of disbelief, as pioneering engineers, armed with new materials, fresh theoretical understanding, and a bolder, almost defiant vision, started tackling coastal locations previously deemed utterly impossible for construction, places where the sea seemed to rule supreme. One mainstream historical fact that stands as a monumental testament to this era of innovation is the construction of the Eddystone Lighthouse off the treacherous coast of Cornwall, England. This wasn't just another lighthouse. It was an epic, centuries-long battle against the elements, a saga of human perseverance against overwhelming odds. The first Eddystone, built by Henry Winstanley in the late 17th century, was a relatively flimsy, octagonal timber structure, almost whimsical in its design, and it was tragically swept away in the infamous Great Storm of 1703, taking Winstanley and everyone else inside with it, a grim and stark reminder of the immense dangers inherent in challenging the raw power of the ocean. But humanity, ever stubborn, persevered. The subsequent Eddystone lighthouses, most notably John Smeaton's third structure completed in 1759, truly revolutionized lighthouse construction, becoming a template for future generations. Smeaton, often rightfully considered the father of civil engineering, innovated with interlocking stone blocks, resembling a tree trunk or an oak, using dovetail joints that allowed the structure to better withstand the immense, battering force of the waves. It was a revelation, a masterpiece of resilience, a stone sentinel planted firmly in the unforgiving embrace of the Atlantic. He even used a revolutionary form of hydraulic lime, a quick-setting cement that could harden underwater, which was a truly cutting-edge material for its time, demonstrating a foresight that bordered on prescience. Historians still argue whether Smeaton's incredibly successful design was purely based on empirical observation and meticulous trial and error, or if he possessed a deeper, unacknowledged theoretical understanding of hydrodynamics and structural integrity, given its unprecedented and enduring success. The impact of these early modern lighthouses was profound and transformative. For the first time, ships could navigate treacherous coastlines, dense fog banks, and hidden reefs with a degree of confidence and safety previously unimaginable. The light itself, often generated by multiple whale oil or colza oil lamps with meticulously polished parabolic reflectors, while still relatively dim by today's incandescent standards, was a steady, predictable, and life-saving presence. No more relying on erratic, wind-blown bonfires or hoping for perfectly clear starlight in a perpetually cloudy maritime climate. This newfound reliability, slowly but surely, began to reduce the catastrophic rate of shipwrecks, fundamentally transforming maritime commerce, travel, and even naval strategy. Entire industries shifted as trade routes became safer and more predictable. A quirky tidbit from this era, some early lighthouse designs were so novel, so audacious, so utterly unlike anything seen before, that they were viewed with a mixture of awe and disbelief by the public. People often referred to them as sea castles, ocean fortresses, or even floating towers, simply unable to comprehend the sheer engineering marvels rising from the waves, seemingly defying gravity and logic itself. Imagine trying to explain to a skeptical fisherman in 1700s that you were going to build a solid stone tower, hundreds of feet tall, on a submerged rock miles from shore, constantly battered by the Atlantic. You'd probably be laughed out of the pub, or worse, accused of witchcraft or lunacy. It was a monumental undertaking, requiring not just engineering genius, but also incredible human endurance, courage, and almost blind faith in the face of nature's fury. The workers who built these lighthouses, the unsung heroes of this era, faced immense dangers, battling relentless tides, brutal storms, biting cold, and the constant, terrifying threat of being swept away by a rogue wave. Their grit, their determination, and their often unsung sacrifices laid the foundation for the vast, interconnected network of navigational aids that would eventually span the globe, making modern shipping possible. The dawn of the modern lighthouse wasn't just about brighter lights or stronger foundations. It was about a fundamental, paradigm-shifting change in humanity's relationship with the sea. Moving from passive submission to active, albeit often challenging. Control and mastery, with the structures themselves becoming more resilient, capable of withstanding the ocean's fury. The focus began to shift to the daily reality of those solitary individuals who would live and work within them, the lighthouse keepers. You step inside the thick, cool stone walls of a 19th century lighthouse, leaving the tumultuous, roaring sea behind, and instantly feel the profound, almost overwhelming sense of isolation. this isn't just a job. It's a way of life, a solemn, enduring commitment to solitude that few modern professions could ever demand. Imagine swapping your bustling city life, your daily commute, your endless streaming options, and your instant communication for a stone tower miles from the nearest shore, with only the crashing waves, the squawking gulls, and the rhythmic sweep of the light for company. It's a trade-off that sounds almost romantic in a novel, but in reality, it was a test of endurance. The living conditions were, by any contemporary standard, incredibly Spartan, often verging on primitive. A keeper's quarters typically consisted of a few small, cramped rooms, often cold and damp, perpetually smelling of lamp oil, salt spray, and damp stone. You'd have a small kitchen area, perhaps a single sleeping space, and not much else. Personal space was an unimaginable luxury, and privacy was almost non-existent, especially if you shared the duty with other keepers, which was common in larger lighthouses. There was no running water, no electricity in the early days. Every drop of fresh water had to be meticulously collected rainwater or painstakingly brought from the mainland on rare supply trips, making it a precious, guarded commodity. Heating relied entirely on coal or wood, which also had to be ferried out in heavy, laborious loads, adding significantly to the logistical challenges and the sheer physical effort of daily life. It was a life stripped bare of all but the absolute essentials, demanding immense self-sufficiency, unwavering resilience, and an uncanny ability to find contentment in monotony. A mainstream historical fact is that lighthouse keepers often worked incredibly long, arduous shifts, frequently 12 hours on, followed by 12 hours off, or even longer in more remote or two-man stations. This meant that for half of every day, you were responsible for the lives of countless sailors. Their primary duty, the very reason for their existence, was, of course, keeping the light burning brightly and consistently, ensuring its unwavering signal reached out across the dark waters. This meant meticulously cleaning the lamp and reflectors of any soot or salt spray, trimming the wicks with precision, refilling the oil reservoirs, which could be enormous and heavy, and winding the intricate clockwork mechanisms that rotated the lens once those revolutionary devices were invented, which we'll delve into later. It was a repetitive, monotonous, yet incredibly meticulous and critically important routine, performed day in and day out, regardless of the weather, personal inclination, or even illness. Imagine doing the same series of precise, vital tasks, often in complete darkness, punctuated only by the flickering lamp, with only the rhythmic creak of the machinery and the constant, often terrifying howl of the wind outside. It required a level of dedication bordering on obsession, a quiet, almost monastic commitment to duty. Historians still argue whether the perceived eccentricities and isolated mental states of some keepers were an inherent result of the extreme isolation itself, or if only individuals already predisposed to solitude and introspection were drawn to, or could even tolerate, such a profoundly isolated profession in the first place. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was deeply, profoundly psychological. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, with only the occasional, highly anticipated supply boat breaking the profound monotony and bringing a fleeting connection to the outside world. Imagine the sheer, overwhelming silence, broken only by the relentless elements. The complete absence of human chatter, the lack of new faces, new conversations, new stimuli. A quirky tidbit from this era to combat the extreme loneliness and soul-crushing boredom. Some keepers developed incredibly intricate and sometimes bizarre hobbies. These ranged from carving detailed ship models from driftwood, painstakingly assembling complex puzzles, or writing extensive, introspective diaries filled with minute observations, to even attempting to train resident seagulls to perform tricks, or holding long, philosophical conversations with the very lamp they tended. It was a testament to the indomitable human spirit's desperate need for engagement, for connection, even if that connection was with an inanimate object or a feathered friend. A creative way to keep the mind from drifting into the vast, echoing emptiness that surrounded them. You quickly learned to live by the immutable rhythms of the sea and the light itself. The rising and setting of the sun dictated your rigid schedule. The relentless tides influenced your potential for resupply and the rare chance to step on solid ground. And the weather was an ever-present, often hostile, companion, dictating every aspect of your existence. There was no popping down to the corner store for a forgotten item, no quick chat with a friendly neighbor. Your entire world shrank to the confining walls of that stone tower, and your universe revolved entirely around the steady, reassuring, yet endlessly repetitive blink of your lamp, a beacon of hope for countless others, but often a lonely, solitary vigil for yourself. It was a demanding, ascetic, and profoundly solitary existence, an existence that indelibly shaped the very character of the men, and, occasionally, women who answered the almost spiritual call of the light. The life of a lighthouse keeper was, in essence, a masterclass in extreme, prolonged isolation, a kind of voluntary solitary confinement undertaken with a vital, life-saving purpose. You might think you enjoy your quiet evenings, perhaps a weekend away from the constant buzz of modern life, but this was an entirely different league of solitude. This wasn't a temporary choice for a few days of digital detox. It was a profound, binding commitment for months, sometimes even years, to a life defined almost entirely by the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean. The psychological toll of such sustained and unrelenting solitude became as much a fundamental part of the job description as diligently tending the lamp itself. A silent, internal struggle waged alongside the external battle against the elements. Imagine waking up, day after day, to the same four cold, stone walls, the same relentless, hypnotic rhythm of the waves crashing against the base of your tower, the same limited, unchanging view out across the vast, empty sea. Your entire world shrinks, claustrophobically, to the circumference of your tower. The sense of routine, while perhaps initially comforting in its predictability, could also become soul-crushingly monotonous, a gray, endless cycle. There were no unexpected visitors unless a raging storm sent a desperate, shipwrecked sailor scrambling for refuge on your rocks. No spontaneous outings to break the tedium. No chance encounters to spark a new thought or conversation. Your conversations, if you were fortunate enough to have a fellow keeper, were often limited to the purely practical aspects of keeping the light, the ever-present weather, and perhaps the occasional musings on the distant world, gleaned from a dog-eared, months-old newspaper brought on the last, rare supply run. One mainstream historical fact is that many keepers, particularly those in the most remote stations, suffered from what was colloquially known as lighthouse fever, or the crazies, terms that encompassed a disturbing range of psychological and emotional effects stemming directly from extreme, prolonged isolation. This could manifest in various ways severe depression that clung like a perpetual fog, crippling anxiety that gnawed at their peace, vivid hallucinations that blurred the line between reality and imagination, or an increased susceptibility to paranoia, seeing threats in the shifting shadows or hearing voices in the wind. The constant, booming roar of the sea, the piercing, rhythmic clang of the fog signal, or conversely, the sheer, unbreaking quiet during calm spells, all of it could play insidious tricks on the mind, eroding one's grip on reality. Historians still argue about the exact prevalence and clinical severity of these conditions, as medical records from that era were often anecdotal, incomplete, and the understanding of mental health was, frankly, rudimentary compared to today. Was it a genuine, diagnosable psychiatric condition, or simply the understandable, crushing stress of an unbearable, unnatural existence that pushed even the most resilient individuals to their psychological limits? To cope with this profound and pervasive isolation, keepers developed various, often ingenious, strategies to keep their minds active and prevent themselves from succumbing to the creeping madness. Some found solace in strict, almost ritualistic adherence to their duties, the meticulous upkeep of the lamp and machinery becoming a form of meditative practice, a tangible way to assert control in an uncontrollable environment. Others immersed themselves in hobbies, like detailed log-keeping that chronicled every minute event, becoming amateur meteorologists or naturalists, or reading every single book on the supply boat, often rereading them until the pages were worn thin and faded from handling. A quirky tidbit, bordering on the poignant some keepers, in their desperate need for companionship, would famously engage in lengthy, one-sided conversations with inanimate objects, like the lighthouse lamp itself, or even the resident seagulls, giving them names and distinct personalities, purely for the sake of having someone to talk to voice their thoughts aloud. It sounds whimsical, perhaps even charmingly eccentric, but it speaks volumes about the profound, unyielding human need for interaction and connection. You can almost picture them, leaning against the cold stone, whispering their deepest thoughts and fears to a startled bird, or sharing a secret with the polished brass of the Fresnel lens, finding a strange, silent confidant in the very heart of their solitary duty. The bond between keepers in a two-man station could be incredibly strong, forged in the crucible of shared hardship and mutual reliance. A partnership that often transcended mere friendship. Or, conversely, it could be intensely strained, with minor quirks or petty disagreements escalating into major, unresolvable irritations within the confining space, with absolutely no escape or external mediation. Imagine being stuck with your least favorite coworker, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months on end, with no means of escape. Arguments over trivial matters, the temperature of the tea, the placement of a book. A slight snoring habit could become epic battles of wills, echoing through the empty stone shaft. This constant presence, or profound lack thereof, of other humans truly defined their existence. This profound, almost spiritual solitude, while ensuring the safety of countless ships navigating the treacherous coasts, came at a very real and significant human cost, shaping the very fabric of their minds and leaving an indelible mark on their souls. The light shone brightly for the world, but for the keeper, it was often a lonely, quiet fire within, a testament to their enduring, often silent, sacrifice. As the solitary keepers wrestled with the psychological demands of their remote posts, another, more gradual transformation was occurring within the very heart of the lighthouse itself. The slow, incremental march of technological advancements. You can almost hear the soft hum of progress, a quiet revolution that would, over decades, profoundly alter the efficiency and power of these vital beacons. The earliest lights, as we've discussed, were essentially just large bonfires or crude oil lamps, barely more advanced than what you might use for camping, albeit scaled up significantly. But the need for brighter, more reliable, and more easily maintained light sources was paramount. A ship's fate, after all, often hinged on the faint flicker visible on the horizon. Initially, the improvements were humble, focused on refining existing methods. Whale oil, a staple for illumination in the 18th century, was a common fuel, but it produced a smoky, inconsistent flame. Then came colza oil, extracted from rapeseed, which burned cleaner and brighter. A small but significant upgrade that eased the keeper's burden slightly. Imagine the endless task of trimming sooty wicks and cleaning blackened glass every few hours. Every innovation, no matter how minor, was a welcome reprieve. One mainstream historical fact is the development of the argon lamp in the late 18th century by Aimé Argan. This lamp, with its tubular wick and central air draft, dramatically increased the brightness and cleanliness of the flame compared to traditional flat wick lamps. It was a revelation for lighthouses, providing a stronger, more consistent light. This wasn't some flashy new gadget. It was a fundamental improvement in combustion science applied to a critical need, making the existing oil lights far more effective and less of a constant battle against smoke and dimness. Historians still argue about the precise extent of its adoption across all lighthouse services, as some remote or less funded lights lagged behind in upgrading their equipment for many years. Beyond the fuel and the burner itself, attention turned to how best to project that precious light out to sea. Early lighthouses used simple parabolic mirrors, often made of polished metal, to reflect the light in a concentrated beam. It was a step up from just an open flame, but these mirrors were far from perfect. They could tarnish easily, requiring constant, meticulous polishing, another endless task for the keeper. And even perfectly polished, they scattered a good deal of light inefficiently. Think of trying to light up a football field with a single flashlight and a curved piece of tinfoil. You'd get some illumination, but it wouldn't be terribly effective. A quirky tidbit from this era is the brief, but rather ambitious, experimentation with carbon arc lamps in the mid-19th century. These lamps, which produced an incredibly intense light by passing electricity between two carbon rods, were, for their time, dazzlingly bright. You might compare them to the first floodlights. However, they were wildly impractical for lighthouse use. They consumed enormous amounts of power, required constant adjustment of the carbon rods, and produced noxious fumes. Imagine a keeper having to manually crank a generator all night, while simultaneously adjusting glowing carbon rods and trying not to inhale anything too toxic. It was a brilliant concept, but definitely ahead of its time for remote, self-sufficient structures like lighthouses. It was like trying to power your smartphone with a steam engine. Technically possible, but utterly inefficient and probably a fire hazard. So, while the keepers performed their unwavering vigil, the quiet work of inventors and engineers in laboratories and workshops slowly chipped away at the inefficiencies of the light source. Each small improvement, from a cleaner burning oil to a more effective lamp design, cumulatively contributed to a beacon that was not just brighter, but also more reliable and easier to maintain. These technological nudges, though seemingly minor individually, paved the way for the truly revolutionary leap that was just around the corner. A leap that would forever change how lighthouses projected their life-saving beams across the tumultuous waves. The slow world of the 19th century lighthouse was indeed slow, but beneath the surface, the gears of innovation were steadily, inexorably turning. If the previous section hinted at technological nudges, Then this one is about a seismic shift. A moment when the very nature of lighthouse illumination was fundamentally, brilliantly transformed. You've seen how early lights struggled for efficiency and brightness, often fighting against the very limitations of physics. But then came an invention that, in hindsight, seems so obvious, yet at the time, was nothing short of revolutionary: the Fresnel lens. Prepare to have your mind, and indeed your view of distant ships, completely blown. Before the Fresnel lens, the best way to get light out to sea was through direct flame or simple reflection with mirrors. This was inefficient, scattering light in all directions, much of it uselessly upwards or downwards. Imagine trying to direct a single light bulb with just a flat mirror. You'd lose so much light. What was needed was a way to gather nearly all the light from a central source and focus it into a powerful, concentrated beam that could pierce through miles of darkness, fog, and even light rain. This is where Augustin-Jean Fresnel, a French physicist, stepped in during the early 19th century. One mainstream historical fact is that Fresnel, working for the French Lighthouse Commission, developed a radical new type of lens, composed of a series of concentric rings rather than a single, thick piece of glass. Each ring was carefully angled to refract but bend the light from a central lamp into a parallel beam. This ingenious design meant the lens could be much thinner and lighter than a conventional lens of comparable power, and crucially, it captured and magnified vastly more light. Think of it like taking all the scattered light from a candle and squeezing it into a laser beam. The impact was immediate and profound. A Fresnel lens could increase the visibility of a lighthouse by 10 times or more compared to older systems. Historians still argue whether the initial resistance to adopting Fresnel lenses in some countries was due to scientific skepticism or purely bureaucratic inertia, given its undeniable superiority. The introduction of the Fresnel lens rapidly transformed the power and reach of lighthouses worldwide. Instead of just a general glow, ships could now see a distinct, intense beam, often with a specific flash pattern unique to that lighthouse, allowing for precise identification. This wasn't just about brightness, it was about characteristic, giving each lighthouse a unique voice in the vast symphony of the sea. Imagine trying to navigate by 100 identical faint glows. Now imagine each glow had a distinct, recognizable rhythm, like a Morse code message. The keeper's job shifted from simply maintaining a strong flame to meticulously tending this complex, beautiful, and incredibly effective piece of optical engineering. A quirky tidbit: the very first Fresnel lens, installed at Cordouan Lighthouse in France in 1823, was so powerful and groundbreaking that local fishermen, seeing it for the first time, were reportedly terrified, believing it to be a supernatural phenomenon or some kind of giant. Glowing eye staring out from the tower. Imagine their bewildered faces, accustomed to weak, flickering lamps, suddenly confronted by a dazzling, rotating column of light slicing through the night. It must have seemed like magic. These lenses were also incredibly valuable and delicate, often assembled by master craftsmen with painstaking precision. They weren't just scientific instruments, they were works of art, massive glass jewels that were the beating heart of the lighthouse. The Fresnel lens was a game changer, allowing smaller lights to achieve the range of larger, more expensive ones, and turning already significant lighthouses into truly formidable beacons. It marked the moment when lighthouse technology truly came into its own, providing a reliable, powerful, and distinct signal for ships navigating the world's oceans. It wasn't just an improvement, it was an invention that redefined what a lighthouse could be, ensuring the safety of countless more voyages and cementing the lighthouse's role as the unwavering guardian of the seas. With the advent of the magnificent Fresnel lens enhancing the light's reach, the lighthouse keeper's daily duties and drudgery became more focused, though certainly no less demanding. You're now inside that towering structure, with the lens overhead, a shimmering jewel of glass and brass, and your world revolves around its meticulous care and the rhythm of the rising and setting sun. This wasn't a job for the faint of heart or the easily distracted. It was a constant, repetitive grind, essential for the safety of every ship that passed. Your day would typically begin long before dawn, or perhaps after sunset, depending on your shift. The first and most critical task was to extinguish the lamp if it was morning, or light it if evening. This sounds simple, but it was a ritual requiring precision. You'd carefully lower the lamp from its position within the lens, extinguish the wick, and then begin the painstaking process of cleaning. Every single surface of the lens, those concentric rings you learned about, had to be wiped clean of soot, salt spray, and dust. Imagine cleaning hundreds of individual glass prisms, each one perfectly aligned, knowing that a single smudge could diminish the light's power and potentially endanger a ship. This wasn't a quick wipe. It was a meticulous, hour-long chore, often performed multiple times a day. One mainstream historical fact is that keepers were typically supplied with specific, soft cloths and often had to use fine rouge powder or other polishing agents to ensure the glass was absolutely spotless, free from even the slightest imperfection that could refract light incorrectly. Historians still argue about the exact composition of the polishing materials used in different regions, and how much variation there was from one lighthouse authority to another. Beyond the lens itself, there was the lamp. Whether it was oil, paraffin, or later, vaporized kerosene, the lamp required constant attention. Wicks needed trimming to ensure a clean, bright flame. The fuel reservoirs, often large and heavy, had to be refilled, sometimes several times a night. requiring keepers to haul significant weights of fuel up winding stairs. And if your lighthouse had a rotating lens, powered by an intricate clockwork mechanism, like a giant grandfather clock, then winding that mechanism was a critical, hourly task. Imagine a keeper, perhaps in the dead of night, hearing the faint slowing of the clockwork, scrambling to crank the weights back up, knowing that if it stopped, the unique flash pattern of his light would cease, leading to confusion and peril for passing ships. It was an alarm clock that, if ignored, could lead to disaster. But the duties didn't end with the light itself. You were responsible for the entire structure. This meant routine maintenance painting, minor repairs to the tower, ensuring the structural integrity against the relentless elements. You'd sweep and scrub the winding stairs, dust the intricate brass fittings, and keep the keeper's quarters immaculate. The lighthouse was your home, your workplace, and your sacred trust. There was also the vital task of keeping a detailed logbook. Every incident, every change in weather, every ship sighted, every drop of oil consumed. It all had to be recorded with meticulous precision. These logbooks weren't just bureaucratic exercises. They were vital historical documents, charting maritime traffic and weather patterns, and often providing the only record of specific shipwrecks or near misses. A quirky tidbit is that many keepers developed an almost obsessive relationship with the weather. They became amateur meteorologists, able to predict shifts in wind and impending storms with uncanny accuracy, simply by observing the patterns of the waves, the flight of birds, and the changes in the sky. They would often have their own rudimentary weather instruments, meticulously recording data, almost as a hobby. Imagine the keeper squinting at the horizon, sensing a storm long before any official forecast. His life, and the lives of others. Depending on that intuitive understanding, it was a skill born of endless observation and complete immersion in their environment, a kind of primal connection to the natural world. This constant attention, this endless cycle of care and observation, transformed the keeper from a mere employee into the steadfast guardian of the light, a silent, essential figure in the vast, slow ballet of 19th century maritime life. While the daily drudgery of a lighthouse keeper's life was often one of quiet monotony, there were moments, terrifying and unforgettable, when nature unleashed its full, unbridled fury. You've settled into the rhythmic hum of the lens, the gentle sway of the tower. But then the barometer begins to drop. The wind picks up its whisper to a howl, and you realize you're about to brave a storm and survival within your isolated stone sanctuary. These were the moments that defined the keeper's courage, when their vigilance was tested to its absolute limit, and when the very foundation of their world seemed to tremble. Imagine a storm rolling in, not just a squall, but a full-blown tempest. The sky turns a bruised purple. The waves, which once gently lapped at the base, now rear up like monstrous, frothing beasts, slamming against the tower with unimaginable force. The entire structure groans, vibrates, and shudders. Rain doesn't just fall, it's driven horizontally, feeling like needles against the glass of the lantern room. You can hear the wind shrieking through the ironwork, a high-pitched scream that seems to mock your vulnerability. In these conditions, visibility could drop to zero, even with the most powerful Fresnel lens. This is when the fog signal became equally, if not more, crucial than the light. Whether it was a booming cannon, a hand-cranked bell, or later, a powerful foghorn. The keeper's job was to ensure that sound cut through the impenetrable gloom, guiding ships blindly through the maelstrom. One mainstream historical fact is that many keepers considered tending the fog signal during a heavy fog or storm to be even more arduous than managing the light, as it often involved endless manual effort to ring bells or pump air for horns, sometimes for days without ceasings. Historians still argue whether the psychological strain of the relentless, deafening sound of a fog signal contributed more to a keeper's lighthouse fever than the visual isolation. The physical danger during a storm was immense. Waves could reach the lantern room, hundreds of feet above the sea, smashing against the thick glass. You'd be soaked, chilled to the bone, fighting against the wind just to move from one side of the room to the other. Debris, torn from the sea, could be hurled at the tower, rattling its very foundations. There are accounts of keepers being swept from the gallery, or of entire sections of their living quarters being inundated by rogue waves. Your vigilance had to be absolute. If the light went out, if the fog signal failed, lives would be lost. You'd check every pane of glass, every fuel line, every mechanism, battling the elements inside as fiercely as the storm raged outside. It was a test of willpower, a marathon of endurance. A quirky tidbit from the annals of lighthouse lore is the tale of keepers who, during particularly severe storms, would resort to desperate measures to keep the light burning. Some accounts speak of keepers literally using their own body heat, or even their clothes, to try and prevent oil from solidifying in the lamps during extreme cold, or constantly bailing out water from leaks in the lantern room with buckets when the normal drainage systems were overwhelmed. Imagine the sheer, raw determination, the primal will to keep that light alive, even as your world bucked and groaned around you. It wasn't about heroics. It was about the profound, unyielding sense of responsibility that permeated every fiber of a keeper's being. Survival wasn't always guaranteed, even within the stout walls of a lighthouse. Many keepers perished in their towers, swallowed by the sea or overcome by the elements. But for those who endured, these storms became defining moments, forging an even deeper, almost symbiotic, bond between them and their lonely towers. They were the silent, steadfast heroes of the night, their unwavering vigil a beacon of hope against the darkest, most terrifying forces of nature. The quiet hum of the lamp, usually a source of comfort, transformed into a desperate plea for survival, a fragile defiance against the chaos of the ocean. After enduring the raw fury of a major storm, or simply after weeks of monotonous, isolated duty, the arrival of the supply and resupply vessel was nothing short of a lifeline, a crucial, life-sustaining link to the world beyond the turbulent waves. You've been living off the dwindling stores, perhaps down to the last few tins of biscuits and a well-thumbed book, when the faint silhouette of a boat finally appears on the horizon. It's more than just a delivery. It's a moment of immense anticipation, a brief, vital connection to humanity. For keepers in remote rock lighthouses, built far offshore on isolated pinnacles of stone, resupply was an art form, fraught with peril. There was no easy dock. Often, the boat couldn't even get alongside the tower. Instead, supplies would be transferred by a system of ropes, slings, and davits. Imagine a small boat bobbing precariously in the swells below, while keepers on the tower, high above, lower ropes, trying to hook onto packages of food, fuel, mail, and other necessities. One mainstream historical fact is that the delivery of fresh water was often the most critical and challenging aspect of resupply for many offshore lighthouses, as rainwater collection was unreliable and water was heavy to transport. Sometimes, if the seas were too rough, the supply boat would have to turn back, leaving the keepers to stretch their dwindling provisions for even longer. Historians still argue about the precise impact of delayed resupply on the morale and physical health of keepers in the most isolated locations, and how often such events occurred compared to official records. The arrival of mail was perhaps even more anticipated than the food. Letters from family, newspapers from the mainland. These were lifelines to civilization, a desperately needed antidote to the creeping isolation. You'd devour the newspapers, even if they were weeks old, trying to catch up on the latest happenings, the political debates, the local gossip. A letter from a loved one could be clutched for days, reread countless times, a tangible piece of connection to a world that felt increasingly distant. This was your social media, your news feed, your connection to everything you'd left behind. Beyond the essentials, the supply boat also brought small luxuries, carefully chosen to alleviate the monotony tobacco. A new book, perhaps some seeds for a tiny, windswept garden if the lighthouse had a patch of earth. These seemingly trivial items gained immense significance in the stark, confined world of the lighthouse. They were tokens of thoughtfulness from the outside, reminders that they hadn't been entirely forgotten. A quirky tidbit is that some keepers developed incredibly intricate signal systems with the passing supply boats, using flags or even light flashes to communicate specific needs or messages without having to risk a perilous landing. Imagine a complex, almost coded conversation conducted purely through visual signals, a silent dialogue between the isolated keepers and their mainland contact. It was a demonstration of the ingenuity born of necessity and the desperate desire for communication. The resupply was rarely a leisurely affair. The unpredictable nature of the sea meant that windows of opportunity for safe transfers were often fleeting. As soon as the supplies were offloaded and the mail exchanged, the boat would often have to depart quickly, leaving the keepers once again to their solitude. The brief flurry of activity would subside, leaving behind a tower filled with fresh provisions and a renewed sense of connection, but also the lingering ache of separation. For a few hours, the outside world had touched the cold stone, and then it was gone, leaving the keeper to resume their quiet vigil, sustained by the delivered goods, and more importantly, by the brief, vital knowledge that they were not entirely alone in their desolate watch. While the solitary existence of a lighthouse keeper often painted a picture of utter isolation, devoid of personal connection, the reality, though profoundly challenging, sometimes allowed for fleeting glimpses of families and community. You might imagine a keeper as a hermit, completely cut off, but the human need for connection, for belonging, found ways to persist, even in the most remote stone towers. These were not easy lives for families, often defined by long separations and immense sacrifice. Yet they added a layer of complexity and quiet heroism to the keeper's story. For keepers stationed in lighthouses on the mainland, or those easily accessible by land, family life, though still shaped by the demanding work schedule, was more feasible. Their wives and children might live in a small cottage adjacent to the tower, creating a semblance of a normal home. Imagine the sounds of children's laughter occasionally echoing up the stone stairs, a stark contrast to the usual silence. These keepers could return to their families after their shifts, sharing meals and experiencing the small comforts of domesticity. One mainstream historical fact is that in some lighthouse services, especially later in the 19th century, it became common for the keeper's wife to be officially, or unofficially, trained as an assistant keeper, particularly in times of illness or emergency. These women often played a vital, though frequently uncredited, role in maintaining the light, learning to clean the lens, trim the wicks, and even wind the clockwork mechanisms. Historians still argue about the true extent of women's involvement in lighthouse duties and whether their contributions were adequately recognized by the authorities of the time. However, for those guardians of the remote rock lighthouses, where weeks or even months passed between supply boats, family life was a luxury largely relegated to memories and distant letters. Wives and children remained on the mainland, their lives a perpetual state of waiting and worry. Imagine the emotional toll of a husband leaving for a 6-month stint on a wave-battered rock, knowing that a severe storm could cut off all communication, leaving his family in agonizing uncertainty. The communication was slow and infrequent, entirely dependent on those irregular supply runs. A letter might take weeks to arrive, and a reply even longer. You'd write about the mundane details of your isolated life, longing for news from home, for a shared sense of normalcy. A quirky tidbit that illustrates the desperate desire for family connection is the practice, in some isolated stations, of keepers keeping pets, often cats to control mice, or even dogs, which became surrogate companions. These animals, against all odds, would sometimes learn to tolerate the incessant clang of the fog signal or the powerful beam of the light. Imagine a gruff keeper, weathered by years of solitude, sharing his meager rations with a scruffy, loyal cat, whispering his thoughts to it in the dead of night. It was a small but significant way to combat the profound loneliness. A flicker of warmth in the stark, unfeeling stone. When families did visit, it was a momentous occasion, a brief explosion of life and chatter in the quiet tower. Children would explore the winding stairs and marvel at the giant lens, a stark contrast to their usual world. But these visits were rare and fleeting, quickly followed by another painful farewell. The keeper's dedication to their duty, to the safety of others, often came at the profound personal cost of separation from their loved ones. They were, in a way, married to the light, their primary devotion given to its unwavering beam. Yet, these scattered connections, the enduring love of a distant family, and the brief moments of shared humanity, were the quiet anchors that kept many keepers from drifting into the abyss of isolation, providing the strength to continue their vital, solitary vigil within the hallowed, often eerie silence of the lighthouse. Stories were born, tales of the unusual, the unexplainable, and the genuinely eccentric. You've explored the routine, the technology, the isolation. Now, prepare to encounter the eccentrics and legends that clung to these remote beacons like barnacles to a hull. Lighthouse keepers, by virtue of their solitary profession, were often seen as figures slightly removed from conventional society, and this environment became a fertile ground for peculiar habits and enduring myths. Some keepers were renowned for their extraordinary dedication, bordering on obsession. There are accounts of keepers who would polish the brass fittings of their lanterns to such a gleaming sheen that they reflected light even in the daytime, or who developed incredibly intricate, almost ceremonial, rituals for lighting and extinguishing the lamp. Imagine a keeper so devoted to his light that he would speak to it, coaxing it, praising it for its unwavering brilliance. One mainstream historical fact is the legendary story of the Smalls Lighthouse in Wales in 1801, where two keepers, Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith, were manning the station. When Griffith died, Howl, fearing he would be accused of murder if he simply cast the body into the sea, kept the decaying corpse inside the small living quarters for weeks. The psychological torment of sharing such a confined space with a decomposing body, while simultaneously trying to maintain the light, drove him to the brink of madness. This horrific incident directly led to the implementation of three-man crews for remote lighthouses, ensuring no keeper would ever again be entirely alone with such a grim dilemma. Historians still argue about the exact sequence of events and whether Howell's account was entirely reliable, given his extreme mental state at the time. The isolation also fostered unusual hobbies and eccentricities. We've touched on the pets, but some keepers took their pastimes to remarkable extremes. There are tales of keepers who became self-taught experts in specific fields' botany, meticulously documenting every scrap of plant life on their barren rock. Astronomy, charting constellations with an accuracy that rivaled professional observatories, or even intricate miniature shipbuilding, crafting entire fleets in bottles with nimble fingers. A quirky tidbit is the story of a keeper who, driven by boredom, taught a flock of seagulls to respond to complex commands, turning them into a rather peculiar, feathered personal army. Imagine the surprise of a passing sailor seeing a keeper apparently conducting an avian orchestra from his lonely perch. These were not just pastimes. They were crucial coping mechanisms. Ways to assert control and maintain sanity in an environment designed to strip away conventional stimuli. Then there are the legends, the ghost stories, the unexplained phenomena that inevitably arose from such isolated, often tragic, locations. Lighthouses, with their dramatic settings and often fatal histories, are ripe for tales of spectral shipwrecks, phantom lights, and the restless spirits of drowned sailors or long-dead keepers. You hear whispers of keepers seeing their deceased predecessors tending the lamp, or the ghostly echo of a foghorn on a clear night. These stories, passed down through generations of keepers and local communities, became part of the lighthouse's very fabric, blending fact and folklore in an often indistinguishable way. These eccentricities and legends, whether rooted in verifiable events or the fertile ground of an isolated mind, collectively paint a vivid picture of the human spirit's capacity for adaptation, endurance, and sometimes profound strangeness. They remind us that the men and women who served the lights were more than just dutiful civil servants. They were unique individuals, shaped by the harsh environment and their extraordinary calling, leaving behind a legacy as intriguing and enduring as the beams they tended. Their quirks and stories often shone as brightly, if not brighter, than the lamps themselves. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, a new, almost imperceptible tremor began to run through the world of lighthouse keeping. You've seen the keepers battle storms, cope with isolation, and master complex optical systems. But now, a different kind of challenge emerges the slow, relentless advance of automation. The idea of lights that could operate without constant human attention, once a distant dream, slowly began to take shape, and with it, the undeniable feeling that the automated future looms. Initially, these advancements were small, designed to aid the keeper, not replace him. Think of automated bell strikers, operated by clockwork, which removed the arduous task of manually ringing a fog bell for hours on end. Or improved fuel delivery systems that reduced the need for keepers to haul heavy oil cans up hundreds of stairs. These were welcomed innovations, reducing the physical burden and making the lonely job slightly more manageable. But then came the truly revolutionary changes, particularly in the realm of light sources and power generation. One mainstream historical fact is the gradual transition from oil lamps to more efficient and powerful light sources, notably incandescent oil vapor lamps, and later, electric lamps. Incandescent oil vapor lamps, which burned kerosene under pressure to create an extremely bright and stable mantle, offered a significant leap in light intensity and required less frequent attention than traditional oil lamps. But the real game changer was electricity. As electrical generation became more widespread and reliable, lighthouses began to be electrified. This meant brighter lights, yes, but also the potential for fully automated light switching, eliminating the need for a keeper to manually light or extinguish the lamp each day. Historians still argue whether the initial push for automation was primarily driven by cost-saving measures or a genuine desire to remove keepers from dangerous, isolated postings. Beyond the light itself, the development of sophisticated clockwork mechanisms allowed for automated rotation of lenses and complex flash patterns, previously requiring constant human oversight. Then came the ingenious gas mantle and the sun valve, patented by Gustave Dalén in the early 20th century. This was a truly quirky tidbit. The sun valve was a device that used a metal rod, one side black and one side polished, to regulate the gas flow. When the sun shone, the black side would absorb heat and expand, closing the gas valve and extinguishing the light. When darkness fell, the rod would contract, opening the valve and allowing the light to ignite automatically. Imagine a lighthouse that literally turned itself on and off with the rising and setting of the sun, all without human intervention. This was a massive step towards full automation, allowing for unattended lights to operate for months on end. It was a kind of primitive, mechanical, artificial intelligence, quietly deciding when to shine. The implications were clear if a lighthouse could light itself, rotate its own lens, and even manage its own fuel supply for extended periods. What exactly was the keeper's purpose? The role slowly began to shift from a constant, hands-on vigil to one of maintenance, occasional repairs, and monitoring. The immediate impact wasn't a sudden mass redundancy, but a subtle reduction in the need for multiple keepers at some stations, and a quiet re-evaluation of the keeper's essential duties. the light continued to shine. But the human element, once the sole source of its unwavering presence, began to recede, yielding to the precise, tireless efficiency of the machine. The very nature of the slow world of the 19th century lighthouse keeper was heading towards an unavoidable, technologically driven transformation. With the relentless march of technology, that looming automated future began to crystallize into a quiet, but undeniable, reality. You've witnessed the slow evolution from bonfires to argand lamps, then to the majestic Fresnel lens, and finally, the promise of gas and electric lights. Now, you stand at the precipice of a significant turning point, the end of an era for the traditional lighthouse keeper. This wasn't a sudden, dramatic extinction, but a gradual fading, a transition that spanned decades, driven by efficiency, safety, and a cold, hard look at budgets. As early as the late 19th century, and increasingly throughout the 20th, lighthouse authorities around the world began to seriously consider the full automation of their networks. The benefits were clear. Automated lights meant significantly reduced operating costs, as the hefty salaries and provisions for keepers could be eliminated. It also meant removing human beings from incredibly dangerous and isolated posts, often in locations that were logistical nightmares to resupply. Imagine the constant worry of keepers falling ill, or the immense expense of sending out relief crews in stormy weather. Automation promised a solution to these persistent problems. One mainstream historical fact is that the process of de-manning lighthouses, where keepers were removed and the lights made fully automatic, gained significant momentum in the mid-20th century, particularly after World War II. Advances in reliable electronics, better battery technology, solar power, and improved remote monitoring systems made it increasingly feasible for a lighthouse to operate entirely on its own for extended periods. The iconic flash you saw from a distance was no longer the result of a human hand meticulously winding a clockwork mechanism. It was a circuit board, a timer, and an electric lamp. Historians still argue about the social and economic impact of de-manning on the small, coastal communities that had often grown up around lighthouses, supporting the keepers and their families. The transition wasn't always smooth. Many keepers, deeply attached to their lights and their way of life, resisted the change, viewing it as an insult to their decades of dedication. They saw the value of a human presence, the ability to spot distress signals, to offer aid to shipwrecked sailors, to provide a human connection in an otherwise desolate maritime landscape. A machine, no matter how reliable, couldn't perform these subtle, intuitive, and compassionate duties. Imagine the quiet heartbreak of a keeper receiving the official notice that his beloved tower would soon be automated, that his life's purpose was effectively being deemed redundant by a circuit board. A quirky tidbit that highlights the emotional aspect of this transition is the trend of keepers leaving small personal time capsules within the lighthouse before demanning, or carving their initials into hidden corners of the tower as a final, silent protest or a lasting mark of their presence. These weren't just buildings, they were homes, sanctuaries, and witnesses to countless solitary hours. Some keepers even famously refused to leave until physically removed, clinging to their post with a stubborn devotion that baffled officials. It was like saying goodbye to a living entity, a friend, a protector. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the vast majority of lighthouses around the world had been fully automated. The image of the solitary keeper, tending his flame through the night, largely receded into history, replaced by the silent, tireless hum of machinery. The era of the human lighthouse keeper, a testament to endurance, duty, and unparalleled isolation, was drawing to its close, leaving behind a legacy of light and a quiet, enduring melancholy for a unique way of life that had vanished with the technological tide. As the last human keepers stepped away from their posts, leaving behind the silent, automated sentinels of the sea, their era didn't simply vanish. Instead, it transformed, leaving behind a profound legacy and lingering lights that continue to fascinate and remind us of a bygone age. You might no longer find a keeper meticulously polishing brass or winding mechanisms, but their spirit, their unwavering dedication, continues to illuminate the narratives of these iconic structures. The lights still shine, but the story behind them has shifted, becoming a quiet elegy for a unique way of life. The lighthouses themselves, many of them architectural marvels, stand as enduring monuments to human ingenuity and perseverance. They are now often tourist attractions, museums, or even unique holiday rentals, drawing visitors who seek to glimpse the isolated world the keepers once inhabited. You climb the winding stairs, feel the cool stone, and peer out from the lantern room, imagining the storms, the solitude, the quiet moments of watch. The very fabric of these buildings whispers tales of the past, of duty performed against impossible odds. One mainstream historical fact is that many former lighthouses have been preserved and repurposed by historical societies or conservation groups, recognizing their cultural and architectural significance. These efforts ensure that the physical structures, testaments to past engineering, remain for future generations to explore and appreciate. Historians still argue whether the romanticization of the keeper's life in popular culture accurately reflects the grinding reality and hardship these individuals truly faced, or if it glosses over the difficult aspects of the profession. Beyond the physical structures, the cultural impact of lighthouse keepers is immense and enduring. They are figures of myth and legend, symbols of steadfastness, vigilance, and the lonely heroism of standing against the elements. Their stories, often tinged with sadness and extreme isolation, resonate deeply with our own modern anxieties about connection and solitude. Think of the art, the literature, the films that have been inspired by their solitary vigils. They capture a timeless human experience. A quirky tidbit is how many lighthouse designs became unique symbols for their regions, appearing on everything from local currency to official tourism emblems. They're not just navigation aids anymore. They're icons, deeply embedded in the identity of coastal communities around the world, representing safety, guidance, and a connection to maritime heritage. Imagine a small fishing village whose entire identity is tied to the distinct flash of its lighthouse, a comforting presence on the horizon. Today's automated lights, powered by solar panels and maintained by remote technicians, are undeniably efficient and safe. They continue the vital work of guiding ships, silently fulfilling the promise of a safer sea. But something has been lost. A human element that no amount of technological sophistication can replicate. The personal touch. The human decision-making in a crisis. The sheer force of human will against the elements. These are the things that defined the Keeper's era. The occasional maintenance technician who visits these automated lights is a vastly different figure from the Keeper who lived there, day in and day out, his life inextricably linked to the light. So, as you drift off tonight, think of those slow, unwavering lights. Remember the solitary figures who stood sentinel, tending the flame, battling the storms, and living lives of profound isolation. They were the unsung heroes of the waves, their silent vigil ensuring countless safe passages. Their era may have ended, replaced by the cold logic of automation, but their legacy, the enduring spirit of the lighthouse keeper, continues to shine. A quiet, flickering memory that reminds us of the profound human cost and dedication behind every beam of light that cuts through the dark. This concludes our journey through the slow world of 19th century lighthouse keepers. The rhythmic sounds of the ocean, the gentle creak of the lantern room, the distant, reassuring sweep of the light across the dark waters. Let these images settle softly into your mind. You are safe now, cradled by the history we've explored, the echoes of solitary duty fading into peaceful slumber. There's no need to worry about storms, or fog, or the lonely vigil of a distant beam. Just quiet, soft darkness. Let your breathing deepen, your body relax, and your thoughts become as calm and clear as the stillest sea. You've journeyed through the night with courage and curiosity. Now, it's time to rest. Sweet dreams.